Keanu Reeves stepped into the school hallway, the same hallways he once walked through as a teenager. But everything felt different now. The walls were still there, the floors still echoed under his boots, but time had painted everything in a colder shade. He wasn't the same boy anymore, and neither was the man he was about to meet. The visit was supposed to be quiet. No media, no bodyguard. Just a quick stop at an old place that held pieces of his past. But as he walked deeper into the silent hallways, something made him stop. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, slow, steady, almost fragile. The sound of a mop gliding across the floor broke the silence. Keanu's eyes locked onto the figure. There was something familiar about the way the man held the broom. It couldn't be, but as the man turned, the soft glow of the hallway lights fell on his face. Gray hair, wrinkled hands, tired eyes. It was him, Mr. Alves, the janitor who had quietly watched over the school for decades, unnoticed, uncelebrated. But what was he still doing here? Keanu's heart tightened. The world had changed. He had changed. But Mr. Alves? He was still here, still cleaning floors at 80 years old. But why? That question would lead Keanu down a path he never expected, one that would change both of their lives forever. If you're ready to hear this powerful story, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching. Keanu stood frozen, watching the old man. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he should say something, or if he even wanted to. How do you greet someone who was once part of your life, but probably doesn't even remember you? He took a step closer. His boots made a soft thud on the tiled floor. The janitor paused, leaning on his mop for a second, as if his body was asking for a break. Keanu cleared his throat. Mr. Alves? The old man turned slowly, squinting at the voice. His eyes scanned Keanu's face, confusion flickering behind the tired lines. For a second, there was nothing, just polite curiosity, like he was looking at another stranger passing. But then, something clicked. Keanu. The name hung in the air, soft but surprised, like it belonged to a memory buried deep. Keanu let out a small laugh. Not sure if it was from disbelief. It's been a long time. Mr. Alves blinked, taking in the man standing before. His face softened, but his eyes held the same quiet kindness Keanu remembered. A very long time. There was a pause, the kind of silence that happens when two people are standing in the middle of something neither of them knows how to explain. For most students, Mr. Alves had been just the janitor, a man who cleaned floors and fixed broken lines. But to Keanu, he had been something more, even if he hadn't realized it back then. Keanu's mind flicked back to a night decades ago. A teenage boy sitting alone in the gym, head down, heart heavy, feeling like the whole world had forgotten nobody was supposed to notice him. But Mr. Alves had. Without asking questions, without pushing, he had simply sat down beside him and said, "You're not as invisible as you think, kid." Keanu had never forgotten those words, even if, at the time, he didn't know how much they would mean. Now, standing face to face with the man who had once seen him when no one else did, Keanu realized something. Mr. Alves might have forgotten that, but Keanu never had. Keanu kept talking, trying to fill the awkward space between, but his eyes couldn't stop noticing the way Mr. Alves's hands trembled as he gripped the mop. How his back stayed slightly bent, like he'd been carrying weight for too long. His shoes, the same kind of black work shoes he'd always worn, were cracked at the edges, barely holding together. Then there was his leg. With every few steps, Mr. Alves shifted his weight, trying to hide the leg. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. But Keanu saw it. The whole time, Mr. Alves kept that small smile on his face. The polite, kind people were when they don't want anyone to ask too many questions. But Keanu couldn't help himself. "Why are you still here, Mr. Alves?" The smile stayed, but something flickered behind his eyes, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question, but hoped no one ever would. "Work keeps me moving." It was the kind of answer that sounded simple, but Keanu knew there was more. He glanced at the mop bucket, the old employee badge clipped to Mr. Alves' shirt, the tired lines carved deep into his face. This wasn't about staying busy. This was survival. Keanu wanted to push to ask what was really going on, but something held him back. He could feel how proud Mr. Alves was. Asking too much might make him shut down completely. So Keanu nodded slowly, forcing a small smile of his own. "Yeah, I guess some things never change." Mr. Alves chuckled softly, going back to scrubbing the floor, like the conversation was already over. But Keanu knew the truth was hiding just beneath the surface, and he wasn't leaving without finding it. That night, Keanu sat alone in his apartment. Lights off, city noise humming faintly outside. But his mind was still stuck in those hallways. Stuck on Mr. Alves. Something wasn't sitting right. No one works at 80 unless they have no other choice. The next morning, Keanu made a few quiet phone calls to old friends, to some of the staff still working at the school. Piece by piece, the picture started coming together. Mr. Alves had no family left. His wife passed away years ago. They never had kids. Whatever small circle he once had was gone. He lived alone in a tiny rented apartment not far from the school. People said he'd been there for decades. The kind of place where everything stayed the same, except the rent creeping higher every year. Keanu learned something else too, something that made his stomach twist. Mr. Alves' pension was barely $800 a month, nowhere near enough to survive in a city like Toronto. That's why he was still working. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Decades of quietly serving others, and the world had just left him behind, like he didn't even exist. Keanu leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. How many times had he walked those hallways as a kid, never once wondering what Mr. Alves' life looked like after school hours? How many other students had passed him by without ever thinking twice? Now, all those years later, it was painfully clear. The man who spent his whole life taking care of everyone else had no one left to take care of him. If this story is touching your heart right now, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Keanu lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while the city outside kept moving. Cars passing, distant sirens, life going on like always. But inside his mind, everything had gone quiet. He couldn't stop seeing Mr. Alves, those tired hands, that same gentle smile, still carrying the weight of the world when he should have been resting. Keanu closed his eyes, trying to push it away, but then another memory flickered back, one he'd buried long ago. A notebook, old, worn-out pages filled with messy teenage handwriting. He could still remember what he'd written late one night, when the world felt heavier than it should for a kid his age. If I ever make it, I hope I never forget what it feels like to be lost. For a long time, he'd convinced himself he'd made it on his own, that he'd fought his way through life without anyone ever looking out for him. But now he knew that wasn't true. Someone had seen him when he thought nobody did. Someone had believed in him when he didn't even believe in himself. And that someone was still pushing a mop down the same hallways, just trying to survive. Keanu sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't let this go. Helping with money wouldn't be enough. Not for someone like Mr. Alves. If he was going to do this, he had to change the whole story. Mr. Alves didn't need charity. He needed his dignity back. By the time the sun rose, Keanu had made up his mind. He was going back to that school. And he wasn't leaving without giving Mr. Alves a reason to believe in life again. Keanu sat at his desk, a blank notebook open in front of him. The pen rested in his hand, but he hadn't written a single word. His mind kept circling the same question. How do you help someone without making them feel small? Mr. Alves was the kind of man who would rather break his own body than take a handout. If Keanu walked in with money or a check, the old man would shut him out before he even finished the sentence. No, this had to be bigger. He needed to give Mr. Alves something that couldn't be measured in money, something that would remind him he still mattered. And then it hit him. Mr. Alves had spent his whole life cleaning floors while everyone walked past him. But what if the students finally looked up? What if they saw what Keanu had seen all those years ago? The idea came fast, so simple yet perfect. Life lessons with Mr. Alves. A mentorship program where kids could sit down with Mr. Alves and learn the things no textbook could ever teach. Not about math or history, but about life. About kindness. About fighting battles in silence. About how sometimes the strongest people in the world are the ones nobody notices. But there was one more thing. If Mr. Alves was going to take this job, he'd need his knee fixed first. Keanu grabbed his phone, calling the best doctors he knew. He'd cover the surgery, the recovery, and every bill in between, but not his charity. It would be part of the job, part of what the school needed. By the time Keanu closed the notebook, the plan was set. He wasn't just going to help Mr. Alves retire. He was going to give him a whole new purpose, one that no one could ever take away. The next morning, Keanu walked back into the school, not as a visitor, but with a mission. He found Mr. Alves alone in the janitor's closet, fixing the handle of an old broom with hands that shook more than they used. The small room smelled like cleaning supplies, the kind of place most people would never bother stepping in. Keanu stood in the doorway, holding the folded paper with the mentorship program written on it. His heart was pounding because he knew this part wouldn't be easy. Mr. Alves, the old man looked up, surprised to see him again. Back so soon. Keanu stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. I need to talk to you about something. Mr. Alves set the broom down, wiping his hands on a worn-out rag. Keanu could see it in his eyes. He already knew where this was going. Keanu, whatever you're about to offer me, I can't take it. Keanu nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting those exact words. I'm not offering you charity. He unfolded the paper and placed it on the desk. I'm offering you a job. Mr. Alves's brow furrowed as his eyes scanned the page. The words life lessons with Mr. Alves were written at the top. Mentor? What would I even teach? Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady. Everything they don't learn in books. How to be kind. How to survive when life gets hard. How to see the people nobody else sees. The old man swallowed, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. For decades, he'd spent his life in the background, always watching, always helping, but never once thinking he had something to... Keanu, I'm just a janitor. Keanu's voice broke a little. No, you're not. You never were. The room went quiet. For a long time, Mr. Alves just sat there, staring at the paper like he was seeing himself through someone else's eyes. His chest rose and fell slowly. And then, finally, the wall he'd built up for years started to crack. His eyes welled up, not from sadness, but from the simple fact that, after all this, someone still saw him. He pressed a rough hand against his face, trying to hold back the tears, but there was no hiding them. Keanu reached across the desk, resting a hand on the old man's shoulder. You're not done yet, Mr. Alves. The old man nodded slowly, because deep down he knew Keanu was right. A few weeks later, the janitor's closet stood, and the old broom leaned against the wall, untouched. For the first time in decades, Mr. Alves wasn't there. Instead, he was in a hospital bed, his leg wrapped in fresh bandages after a knee surgery Keanu made sure was done by the best doctors in the city. The recovery wasn't easy. The man who had spent his whole life working through pain didn't know how to sit still. But Keanu visited him every few days, checking in without making a big deal out of it. Most of the time, they just sat in silence. Two different lives, tied together by something neither of them could fully explain. By the time Mr. Alves finally walked back through the school doors, he wasn't holding a mop anymore. He carried a small notebook instead, the same kind he used to tuck away in his pocket, scribbling down names of students who might need a little extra kindness. The school gave him a small office, nothing fancy, just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a window overlooking the courtyard. His first day as Mr. Alves, the mentor started with only one student. But by the end of the week, there was a line outside his door. They came with questions about life, about heartbreak, about how to keep going when everything feels heavy. And Mr. Alves? He answered them the same way he'd always done, quietly, patiently, like he had all the time in the world. The same man who had once cleaned the floors, now sat in those same classrooms, teaching what life had taught him. Not with books, not with lectures, but with stories, the kind only a man like him could ever tell. Months passed, and life slowly started to feel different for Mr. Alves. His limp was gone, and the tired weight in his eyes had started to lift. He walked the hallways without a mop in his hand, but students still stopped to greet him. Only now they called him sir. Every afternoon, he'd sit in his small office, sharing quiet advice with kids who felt invisible, the same way Keanu once had. The paycheck came every month, but that wasn't what kept him going. It was purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. But Keanu wasn't done. One afternoon, he walked into Mr. Alves's office holding a small envelope. He set it down on the desk without saying a word. Mr. Alves glanced at it, then back at Keanu. What's this? Keanu smiled softly. Open it. The old man unfolded the paper inside, his rough fingers trembling slightly as he read the word. It was a plane ticket, a flight to Portugal to see his brother, the man he hadn't hugged, laughed with, or even laid eyes on in over 40 years. Mr. Alves blinked, his mouth slightly open, like he couldn't believe what he was holding. Keanu, I can't accept this. Keanu leaned in, his voice steady. You're not accepting it. You're earning it. The old man's eyes stayed fixed on the ticket, his chest rising and falling slowly. For decades, he'd lived in the shadows, forgotten by the world, with nothing to hold on to but his daily routine. But now, someone had reached back into his life and given him something no amount of money could ever buy. A chance to go back to the place where he still had one person left waiting. The old man pressed the ticket against his chest, not saying a word. Because sometimes the greatest reward isn't a paycheck. It's the chance to go home again. A few days after Mr. Alves left for Portugal, Keanu sat alone in his apartment, the same city lights flickering outside his window. His mind felt heavy, but in a way that brought a strange kind of peace. He opened an old wooden box tucked deep inside his closet, the kind of box people carry from one home to another without ever really opening. Inside was a worn-out notebook. Its edges were curled, the paper yellowed from time. He hadn't seen it in decades. Keanu flipped through the pages slowly, scribbled thoughts from a teenage boy who once felt invisible. Pages filled with frustration, doubt, and quiet prayers that someone, somewhere would see him. But one line at the very end made his chest tighten. If I ever make it, I hope I help someone else find their way. Keanu leaned back, staring at the sentence for a long time. He had made it, the money, the fame, the life most people only dream about. But none of that had ever really mattered. What mattered was what Mr. Alves had taught him all those years ago, that even the smallest kindness could leave a mark that lasts a lifetime. Keanu closed the notebook gently, running his fingers across the worn leather cover, because without even realizing it, he had become exactly what he once hoped to be, a man who never forgot what it felt like to be lost, and someone who reached back to help someone else find their way. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us who is the unsung hero in your life.